who are the top 500? It's given out every 6 months. I've been following this since I was a little kid. Number 1 is 𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏. It's a cray. In fact, the top 3 of these are crays. It's got 11 million cores. I just rented a pretty beefy computer from AWS. It's what's the $6, I think. So it's $4,000 a month to rent. And what's funny is this thing doesn't have a GPU. It's for a very specific stock market problem. You know, I do think if you want to really get the truth, get the answer to these questions, you have to make an intellectually honest effort to really get into it and find what the answer is. All right, so this is the machine I rented to do this job. There's 128 cores, 250 gigabytes of RAM. This is a big boy. This guy's got 11 million cores, 29 megawatts of power required. This is a DOE computer at Livermore. Now you could rent it. Frontier is a well-known one. Eagle is part of Azure. That's interesting. You can see that for a long time the Chinese were number 1 in all of these. It's fell off actually. China no longer number 1. Now, do you know who has this Jupiter? You take a wild guess whose computer this is. Jülich, the D-Wave guys. Because they buy everything. They are trying to be number 1 in the world on everything. Okay, so why would you ever want to use a quantum computer? We're getting back to this. So if you have a problem at exponential time, it increases, right, as the input increases. So 2 to the n can get very big. And it's funny because at small numbers like 2 to the 3rd or 2 to the 5th, these are really like manageable, right? But at some point, they get really out of control. It doesn't take long before these numbers scale like crazy. This is why it's an exponential, right? So n is down here, and 2 to the n is this chart. So these are the really impossible problems, and they are combinatorial problems. So things like optimization, many-body physics, factoring, etc. They're really, really hard to solve. Like, what's the factorization of some, large number like this? Every number I add, it actually gets harder, exponentially harder to solve. That's why this program that I added, every number I add, this finally finished up. But you can see it took 200 seconds. The problem before only took 16 seconds. So it's actually getting slower over time. I 10x the problem set. And no matter how fast I make this, I can't get out of the exponential problem. I can keep trying to speed it up using different techniques, but I can't outrun the exponent no matter what. And you should try this with your own computer. Some of these programs I've written are 100 lines of code. This one's a lot more complex, but you could probably do it with 20 lines of code. Find yourself an exponential problem, and you'll see why you need a quantum computer for certain problems. But most problems live in the polynomial world, where we would never, ever, ever, there's no reason why you'd ever want to do a polynomial-sized problem on a quantum computer. That's my contention. Only reason you'd want to do a problem on a quantum computer is if you can go from here to here, from this world to this world. There's only one problem we know about where you can take a wormhole and go from this space to this space. That's Shor's. So what's a polynomial problem? Well, you could just do some factoring. Let's say we have a really big number here. We'll call that n. And then we could do the last term is, I don't know, plus 73. And the question is, what does this factor into? Well, this is a hard problem. You wouldn't want to see this on your algebra exam, but there may or may not be an answer. You can get there even if this term gets really big. The problem does not get much harder. That's a polynomial time problem. You don't need a quantum computer for this, no matter how big x gets, or this coefficient of x. The one algorithm we know that'll do this, that'll take it from this kind of a problem to this kind of a problem, is Shor's. And Shor's is only good for encryption and decryption. So there's actually no need for a quantum computer until we find a new algorithm. Grover is kind of this little guy hanging around in the background. It can get you from O(n) to O root n. So instead of, let's say something like 2 to the 10 to the 24th, you would then only in quotation marks, you can go to 2 to the 5/12. It's not a great speed up, but there are going to be problems where that wouldn't be so bad. But this isn't some fantastic speed up. I mean, if you're in this exponential regime in the first place, you got problems. So it's very much like not a great place to be. The only reason people are dumping lots of money into this is because it's very cool to anybody who studies this for a living. You know, all the stuff I just showed you, I guess I deleted, about factoring. It boggles the mind of every student in computing. Every one of us loves to look at this and say, oh, could you imagine taking a problem from exponential running time to polynomial running time? That's insanely cool. And believe it or not, things that are insanely cool do get funded. They do get worked on. There is a little bit of a lie, as Chris said in the beginning of this video. To get funding, I have to say this.
𝗦𝗃𝗬𝗕 will pick it up. On the one hand, this is not hypey at all, because
the nerds want to make this stuff because it's the coolest thing in the world to them, and that includes me. But the investors, generally the people investing in this stuff, don't really understand it. They're kind of, you know, praying and hoping for something cool. There's not much that's cool. I want you to listen a little bit more. I'm going to take a 1 second break and just keep listening. It's really important.
compute these 8 numbers, or 2 to the 300 numbers, when you measure an output.
What's amazing about this video is that 333 people have watched this video, and there's 123 subscribers on this channel. An idiot like me makes those numbers look small, and an even bigger idiot makes my numbers look tiny. So literally only 300 people have ever watched this video. More people are watching this video through me right now than have asked to watch this video. And listen to what he's saying. 2 to the 300th. That's more than all the atoms in the universe. And somehow this quantum computer can hold or search through every combination to find an answer. Doesn't mean it's storing all that data. I don't think so, because you'd create a black hole if you did that. What is it doing? How could 300 qubits have that much power? It's an interesting question. I'm not sure if he's back or not, one. If he's quote unquote back, I mean, he has obligations vis-a-vis Duke, you know, he'll have to focus on. I think he clearly has had issues with IonQ's management. And I don't know if 𝗕𝗏𝗂 helps that or hurts that. Like most scientists, he's anti-hype. He's not always remained in an advisor role. At one point he was the CEO. But I hear you. I don't think it's bullish or bearish. You know, Chris, as great as he is, he's just one guy, and it takes more than one guy to really move a field. I do think I'd rather have him on my payroll than not have him on my payroll, that's for sure. And you could see Zuckerberg was willing to pay $30 billion to get 𝗪𝗏𝗏 on his payroll. And is Chris to quantum what Ilya is to AI? Possibly, yeah, quite possibly. It is somebody that you want on your team. Yeah, James, I would agree. You know, I said earlier, maybe you weren't here, that if you're Nick, I wouldn't do it because I'm not an asshole. But if you're Nicolo, you might want to send a cease and desist. You know, you can't muzzle a scientist. I mean, if that's the way he feels, it's the way he feels, right? You know, you're not a dictator. You know, in a corporate environment, you're trying to do the best you can, not hide and smother negative opinion. I agree. I think he's on paper, you know, senior advisor, but they might pay him 10 grand a month or something. Yeah, I don't think I think he's kind of done with IonQ. I mean, every quantum place would want him, and I wouldn't be shocked if he starts a new company. I heard Chapman through the grapevine is starting a new company. We don't know why Chapman left. I think part of the reason was he made a lot of money. I'm guessing Nicolo on the board didn't like what he was up to strategically, you know, and the advice was to go do acquisitions. Chapman was slow about doing that, and then Nicolo showed up and did 5. I'm not sure it's helped the company, by the way. So keep in mind, this is the last useful algorithm in quantum is 31 years old. So don't assume we're getting them cranked out every week. Meme, once you've gotten your founder shares and most of your shares are vested as a CEO, the annual shares you get aren't that much. So a lot of people get out and go do something else. And again, I've heard he might start a new company where, look, I mean, IonQ worked out really well. So if he starts a new company, I'm sure he'll raise capital. He can keep 30-40% of the company, list it, go public, and do this all over again, make billions. So think about this. This is the one thing that quantum's good for. And listen how far away we are.
Maybe you're doing error correction. You might need 1 billion bits to really factor an interesting number. I don't know. Log n is still not great. To factor a big number, you need n is, 2,000 bits. So n squared is 10 million bits. Maybe you're doing error correction. You might need 1 billion bits to really factor an interesting number. So factoring, although we know exactly how it works, we know exactly the pattern of gates we need to build here. It's just way too hard for today's quantum computers.
I think it's pretty clear what he thinks. He's made it abundantly clear. And it's also pretty consistent with where you know, where the science is. You know, nobody's surprised by this, is what most people are saying. Wall Street and others, you know, say something different. Wait, 𝗏𝗏𝗧𝗏 got fired from 𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗧𝗏? They say 𝗏𝗏𝗧𝗏 sold 𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏. He makes it out that he was a big success.
If you were speaking to like your typical like quantum investor, whatever, like person that just downloaded Robinhood and is tossing, you know, their $50 whatever allowance or whatever into this, like if you can explain in a few sentences to that person why quantum does not have a future in very like layman's terms, what would you say to this person without having them to, you know, sit down and listen to like a full 40-minute conversation? What would be your main driving point?
Yeah, so I've done this in the 𝗓𝗓 interview, but basically quantum is a distant technology that solves a very narrow use case. The narrow use case is the set of algorithms that are speed ups in complexity classes largely from exponential to polynomial. Running an algorithm in polynomial time is vastly preferential to running an algorithm in exponential time. Quantum effects allow you to do that by taking advantage of things like entanglement and superposition. But unfortunately, the only known quantum algorithms which take you from exponential time to polynomial time are Shor's algorithm. Shor's algorithm is only relevant for factoring. There's other algorithms, but their speedups are much, much less. Between the distant time it's going to take for quantum to come alive and the very narrow space of computing that it can do, for example, it cannot do AI, it cannot do anything with large amounts of data. It can only do this really, really narrow space of problems. You'd have to be confident that either there's going to be more problems that can be solved, but if you read the literature, there's not much hope. The last major quantum algorithm that was discovered was 25 years ago. There's not much hope that there's going to be another one. In fact, Shor's discovery, which was, you know, a stroke of genius, you know, basically created the need for quantum computers. Without Shor, there never would have been an interest in making quantum computers at all. And so we don't know if we're going to see another Shor's algorithm. We might, but, you know, it could be a cold 25 more years before you see that. And so if you don't think there's going to be a new complexity class shift for a problem of significance, and I would argue most NP hard problems are honestly not problems of significance. But regardless, if you think that, one, you should say, well, what is it and why do you think there'll be a complexity speed up? And then why is this NP hard problem so important? And two, you know, how much revenues are going to be from this NP hard problem? Because if you look at, again, AI, this isn't sort of a quantum problem. This is probably, AI is basically the only computationally difficult problem at the moment. And AI suffers from both large scale of computations in parallel, as well as large amounts of data. The problem with AI is that the RAM size of these chips is really small. And if you're spoon feeding it across all the chips, it's a really difficult problem, where the fabric is actually, you know, almost as valuable as the GPU. So there's a bit of that, you know, dynamic going on where, you know, the problem in AI isn't just I need more machines. It's kind of actually I need bigger machines that have better bandwidth. They're calculating quite quickly. It's actually, a lot of it's the data in transit that's rather difficult. So in any event, you know, we'll see if NVIDIA can scale and techniques can scale, and we may not have a computing problem in as soon as a year or two, or a few years, where what's left to compute. Right now, computing AI is largely the only large-scale computing problem that's really difficult. You could add weather simulation in there or something, but there's very few problems that really require fields and fields of computers. And so that problem will probably be solved before quantum can even, you know, factor a small number. So that's kind of the way I look at it.
Just like quantum computing, where most of the retail investors that buy it don't know what it does. They just think it sounds cool and advanced, so they buy it. Is it like that?
Yeah, I think it's a little bit of that, but they also listen to each other and form community and club. This happened with Cassava, where for every Joe Springer, there was like, and Matt Nachtrab, there were like 50 to 100 people, maybe even thousands of people following each of them, and kind of like, you know, writing their research. But the reality is, if you're going to do that, you might as well do it with a professional. Like, there's no need to do it with somebody that's never done it before. And so it is a thing where, like, oh, that person sounds smart, let me follow them. But then when you look at their track record or their experience, they don't have any, and it's the blind leading the blind. But it is definitely is, like, in the land of the blind, maybe the one-eyed man can get a lot of people to follow them. So I think people relatively understand what InMune is at its base level. But I do think there's a huge part of pharmaceutical analysis that takes, maybe a decade of experience to be very good at. And you're seeing a bit of Dunning-Kruger with some of the leaders, like, again, this happened to Joe Springer. It's the same thing with this Karst guy or whatever his name is. Yeah, it's just Dunning-Kruger. I've done it for a year or two, so I think I'm really great at it. And when the guy who's done it for 25 years tells you maybe you got this wrong, you fold your arms and refuse to think that maybe maybe there's more to this.
I heard you say that there's we currently have 36 qubits in quantum computing, and then I looked up what a super hyperscaler computer has, and it's something like tens of quadrillions of bits. Is a qubit equivalent to a bit, and do you need the same amount of qubits, or does it change?
Yeah, great question. They're not equivalent. Certainly for storage perspective, they're equivalent. But from a computational perspective, the qubit is a lot more powerful. And in raw computational power, you could probably do with 300 logical qubits more than any supercomputer in the world. Having said that, you couldn't do a lot of bandwidth. So you cannot process huge amounts of data, but you could do huge amounts of calculations, like multiplying a number over and over again. So they're really different, obviously, but in the same sense that they store information, and they have, when you read them out, the amount of information they store is very limited. It's the same amount as bits. So they're really good for experiments where you need a number, for example. But when you tune a neural network, for example, or train a neural network, you need, billions of numbers adjusted. And quantum will never be able to do that. Unless you fed each number in one at a time, which would be really difficult to do.
Because this is kind of a memory problem, would I be correct in saying that wouldn't a lot of that innovation come out of the companies that are already doing DRAM chips, Micron and SK Hynix and even Samsung?
I think you could store. Honestly, the best way to do it is to store all this stuff classically and then zap it over to the quantum computer and zap it back. The problem is that you're really transcending media, and the fastest you could do that is going to be still relatively slow compared to transistor switches. But conceptually, you could theoretically get a decoder that, basically a modem, a quantum modem that zaps information from one to the other. Then there's different people thinking about how to do this. So I'm not saying it'll never be solved, but we're probably not going to have quantum USBs anytime soon.
Oh yeah, and I've heard that you've said that QBTS is really misleading with the way that they present things. But Quantum Computing Inc., I know they used to be a beverage company, so that's kind of red flag one. But I've heard that they're also committing some dishonest practices. Do you know anything about that?
Yeah, I haven't done a deep dive into them, but they've announced in their SEC filings that there's some fraud problems. The CEO left. I don't know. There's just so many issues there. They have no revenue. There's lots of problems with this company, but it's pretty clear to me, at least, that it'll be a penny stock pretty soon.
Wow, so they can make a TED Talk, how to turn a beverage company into $1 billion quantum firm in 3 easy steps.
Well, to be fair to them, they did buy a quantum company that was privately held, and they kind of basically did a reverse merger. So when we make fun of them for the beverage thing, I don't think it's too fair. It is funny, but they are a quantum company now. They have 30 people, which is not many. They don't have too many distinguished people from what I know. They have 35K in revs. It's not really clear what they're doing or what their goal is. Sometimes they talk about being a fab. Sometimes they talk about having quantum computers. And sometimes they do contract work. So it's really just this company that has a really nice name. And, you know, for some reason gets kind of lumped into these other companies. And lately it's done really well. For a long time, even the quantum lovers were staying away from it. But now, because all the other quantum stocks got bid up, they kind of, you know, are back in a way.
Oh, wow. So like it really does come down to like a name meaning a lot for valuation, or at least price. But is that like a sign of like too much liquidity, or is that more on a case by case basis?
Yeah, it's definitely a sign of too much liquidity. And this happened to the dot-com bubble too. And the Fed should be raising rates, to be honest, because when you see things like Fartcoin doing well, you know, people should be making choices with their money, hard choices of saying, do I save my money? Do I spend my money? Do I invest in a risky asset? And, you know, and that's really it. When they start thinking that one of their choices is investing in Fartcoin, they, you know, the cost of money is probably too low. And, you know, you see that in all kinds of assets. This asset bubble is pretty clear. It's not just, you know, meme coins, it's also other assets. So I feel like, you know, there's a fairly clear and easy solution to this, which is, you know, raise rates. So, you know, I do think that, you know, a company that barely operates having, you know, a multi-billion valuation because it has a nice name, that's something that, you know, is something that doesn't happen when rates are really high and people have to make those careful decisions.
Right. And would you potentially even see like bankruptcies in, I mean, it could be quantum, or because I know a lot of these quantum companies, they constantly need new funding because obviously they're not generating operating cash flow. But like, would you see, you know, potentially people aren't willing to give them capital and then they could have like actual internal liquidity problems?
Yeah, typically I don't worry about that. One of the things you learn as a public company trader or investor is that it's very hard to kill a company. You know, seldom do publicly traded companies go bankrupt. They usually go through transformations and so forth. The only way they really go bankrupt is when they have debt. Then, you know, with debt, they can sometimes default on the debt. But typically, companies like these always have a second wind. They're kind of options with no expiry in a way. You know, they're just constantly kind of revitalizing, raising capital, recapping, all those types of things.
Do you know like which companies are even like who's giving capital to like D-Wave or QBT? I don't know if that's like stated, but it just seems like I don't know who's willing to lend to them or give them or buy their equity like that.
Yeah, it's speculators. I mean, there's no stock market investors willing to do it. So they're doing what's called an ATM, which is at the market offering. And an ATM is only done really for companies that can't find investors. And all of these companies are doing ATMs. You know, if they were exciting tech companies, we did a presentation. We looked at a presentation from a company called Coatue earlier. Companies like Coatue, who scavenge the whole world for great tech companies, they would say, "Hey, we'll give you 500 million right now for the exact stock price it's at right now." But that's not, you know, what's happening. You know, the banks would love to bank them and take them to their clients, and their clients would get in on a hot deal, but that's not what they're doing. They're just selling stock in the market every day to unsuspecting retailer investors, but also quants and other, you know, folks like that. And eventually, you know, that will end as retail investors wisen up. They go to other stocks that are more exciting, like Oklo is moving more, things like that. You know, they can't take it and they capitulate. But these stocks, thankfully, are now starting to look quite boring, even QUBT. So I feel like, you know, you're going to get, you know, some boredom here, and the prices will atrophy and will be, you know, pretty good on the short side. But it's you know, it's painful, definitely a painful experience watching people speculate on companies they don't understand, and, you know, trying to force the price of a stock to go up by buying it. And, you know, it all ends the same way each time. It's just a question of being smart about how you approach it as an investor or trader.